Thanks, Mab, and thanks everyone for coming. Honestly, it's a real privilege to be here. So the book, I mean, like a lot of things in my, if you know me, I talk about Porthcawl a lot, and then when people come to Porthcawl, they're like, it's just an, I thought it was the way you talk about it is just this amazing sort of Shangri-La, and it's just a sort of relatively run-of-the-mill sort of Welsh or British seaside resort. But Porthcawl has sort of shaped my understanding of class and society and sort of politics in a way because, growing up, it is by the standards of the area sort of a posh town. We were all called posh. And when I was growing up playing football in the Talbot League against sort of Avon Lido and Trevelyan and things like that, I'd get picked on basically. Got called posh. I had long hair. I had hair then. And we called posh, and we called, sounded posh, sounded English. You said, "Are you from you sound English?" So there's a grew up with sort of a real awareness of this like idea of local difference. And obviously, when you're a kid, you start to think, people from Porthcawl drive sort of flash cars, have like sort of bigger detached houses and things like that, and then you go up to the valleys surrounding Porthcawl, and you think, we're not like this, because it's obviously it was more obviously working class, both sort of socially and culturally. And so I grew up thinking, I'm middle class. Porthcawl is a middle class town, and sort of South Wales is working class. That was like my framework. Then, of course, you go to university, and you come across people who I would say are, properly posh or properly middle class or whatever. And then when I was in Aber in uni, people were like, "Oh, the Valley's boy beer," and I was like, "What are you talking about?" I was like, "I'm very posh, actually." But I thought, you do think, and then you start to think, well, where does Porthcawl fit into this then? Because the people you're meeting in university who have this sort of money and sort of ease about them, they were people who were parents were doctors, they were going to become politicians or join the army as officers and become lawyers and things. And I thought, well, Porthcawl isn't like that. People in Porthcawl had a lot more money, but most people were sort of what we call self-made men, builders or plasterers or plumbers and things like that, and very culturally sort of working class. So I then, to cut a long story short, I then did my PhD on Porthcawl. The book on that should be coming out next year, actually. But then I started to think, well, middle class and working class just don't fit. Our understanding of class in the UK is all about culture. You're working class if you like, football and beer and pies or things like that. And then if you like avocado and coffee is a common one. And if you like coffee and things like that, then you're middle class or posh. But then as I started researching, I was like, this like middle class, working class heuristic, and then also this cultural way of understanding class just doesn't really explain anything. It doesn't explain sort of the type of society we live in. It doesn't explain the class structure. And so and then I sort of eventually started reading about this concept of the petty bourgeoisie. The lower middle classes, their sort of tendency towards political conservatism, and then that started to really explain the community that I'd sort of grown up in, because that was the other thing I said. Is because obviously South Wales is Labour. Everyone votes Labour, and I'd see people on Twitter saying, "Well, I don't know anyone who votes Conservative. The Conservatives don't exist in Wales." And I was like, well, that's funny, because in Porthcawl everyone votes Tory, and they're all from the valleys originally, but they moved to Porthcawl and they all become the sort of the chairman of the local Tory party. And then, you start to think, well, who are the people in the UK that are voting for the Conservatives? Because, you have this, obviously I've spent too long on social media, like way too long on Twitter and things like that, but you have this, almost like this despairing attitude on the sort of British and Welsh left sometimes, who voted for Brexit? I don't know anyone that voted for Brexit. Who votes for the Conservatives? And I was thinking, well, actually, I know loads of people that vote Tory. I know, and then everyone I know voted for Brexit. All my mates voted for Brexit. And so what I started to think about writing a book was like, well, by describing this sort of class of people, this group of people, then you can really understand modern British society, because the values that I think that we see, some of the more negative values of the low middle classes that permeate British society, sort of individualism, like a kind of a hardness to British politics. You know, there's like this sort of I'm all right, Jack sort of attitude. I saw that in spades growing up. You know, like when I became, you know, I was like a stereotypical lefty. You know, like coming back to my friends and saying, oh, you know, you should vote Corbyn and things like that. And they were, you know, horrified. And they were, you know, some of my best friends had a real hardness to their politics, you know, and their way of thinking. It's like, well, I've done right. I work all the time. Why should I give something to? Why should I help so and so who doesn't work? There's almost this this view of the working class as sort of feckless and undeserving. And you know, and if I work hard, you know, why should other people have handouts or things like that? So anyway, that's a rambling way of saying it. I thought it was really important to start to explain this group of people, because they're sort of on the edge of the sort of consciousness of the commentariat. You know, when people, the Labour Party, for example, under Starmer, everyone's focus grouping. We have to appeal to normal people. We have to appeal to Middle England, the swing voters. We have to appeal to the man in the street, Essex man. You know, Blair had Mondeo man. The average upstanding, law-abiding citizen. You know, but they never actually get into, well, who are these people? You know, who are these people? Because the term middle class is too vague. It doesn't describe this sort of experience of the lower middle class, of the petty bourgeoisie, because it's a really specific sort of social experience, and they're very specific values. So like the middle class is split. You know, the middle class is huge, and you've got like sort of the professional managerial classes who tend to have sort of quite liberal and progressive sort of social views, and then you have traditionally the lower middle classes have typically been quite socially conservative. You know, they were the sort of the basis of Thatcherism. So anyway, it was just about trying to describe this group of people and sort of their views and ideology, because it's not just about the class, it's about how Thatcher in particular made the values of that class hegemonic, you know, really spread the views of the petty bourgeoisie throughout British society. So I just thought you can't really, and obviously, you know, I was like, well, I need to be the expert on the petty bourgeoisie. I need to be the expert on the petty bourgeoisie. I need to have like a niche in academia or something like that. But yeah, that's why I wrote it, basically.
Yeah, and I think like that's, you know, one of the things you do really well in the book is complicate some of those narratives and break down that like vast sort of middle class. Probably useful just to like go through then, when you're talking about the petty bourgeoisie, who are you talking, like, who are the petty bourgeoisie? How do you define them? Because you also have a dual. There are two types of petty bourgeoisie that you.
Yeah. So what I just said then, I was going to say ignore it, but like, but when I class the petty bourgeoisie as a class that's made up of two fractions or strands. So in the book, if you read it, I say it's like a DNA helix. And I've got to be honest, obviously I don't know anything about DNA, or like what a DNA helix is, or like biology or anything like that. But I was thinking, well, I saw this thing and it's like this spiral. So it looks, so I was like, well, that's a neat way of explaining it. So the petty bourgeoisie, I argue, is sort of split into two. So you have on the one hand the old or the traditional petty bourgeoisie, which is the shopkeeper of old, and obviously the small self-employed, so the small solo self-employed, which are now an enormous chunk of the British population. And it never used to be like that in the UK. You know, even in the late 70s, there was about 1 million self-employed people. There's now close to 5 million. And in 2019, before the pandemic, it was over 5 million. And you know, there's only 5.6 million people who work in the entire public sector. So it's huge. And I'm sure probably most people have noticed during the pandemic, more and more people, it's becoming more normal. More and more people are setting up small businesses. And it's not, just while I'm on the topic of the old petty bourgeoisie, what I'm saying in the book is that the old image of the petty bourgeoisie is basically this idea of the shopkeeper, sort of, or the grocer, which was obviously Margaret Thatcher's dad. And traditionally, the old petty bourgeoisie were associated with quite uptight sort of morality, sort of this, and a real distinction between them and the working class. and a really complicated relationship between the working class, because they live in the same community, but they have a different. Traditionally they split themselves off either by piety. They were traditionally used to go to church a lot more than the working class, and they sort of had there was a lot of tension in the relationship between the working class and the old petty bourgeoisie. But now I'm arguing it's so massive, this class. It's no longer this idea of the old sort of Tory shopkeeper, because it's Deliveroo drivers, so small people working in Pure Gym as personal trainers, hairdressers, it's people who own in small coffee shops. It's an enormous class, and it's also really complex, because more and more, if you look at the IFS and things, all the studies of the small self-employed, they're really struggling, and they're probably the most marginalised group. More and more people are entering self-employment from unemployment. So people aren't. It used to be this idea that you become self-employed because it's a lifelong aspiration. I want to own my own business. But what I find more and more now is that people are like, oh, I hate working in Amazon or Sports Direct or all these other dystopian workplaces that define sort of modern society. So people take the gamble and they go on their own and they create some small business. But then more and more those things fail, then they go back to their old job and then back and forth. So people are sort of moving in between classes over their lifetime. And so that's my idea of the old. But so there's not the whole story. So there's another protagonist, and that's what I call the new petty bourgeoisie. So there's a lot in the book about because when I started to think about writing the book, I was coming back from university after doing either a master's or PhD, but sort of back in Porthcawl again, working behind the bar. And funny enough, I've actually got like a tattoo which says MRO Heat. Before it was before it was cool. But my friends would say, what does that mean? And I said, I mean, still here. And they're like, oh, like you're still here, you? Like you're still like haven't left or can't leave, because I kept ending up back in Porthcawl, and my friends who I went to school with, who I talk about education in the book, but my mates left school at 16. They leave school at 16, and I was, you sort of, without thinking it, it's like you're going to go to do your A-levels, then you should go to university, then you should do your masters, and then a PhD and things like that. But there was an assumption from my friends, like a real. I mean, you said like be careful not to make yourself sound too like pathetic in the book. But when I was back working these sort of low-paid jobs, coming up to 30, still working in a bar and things, my friends from school were genuinely shocked. Like, what are you doing back here? You were like a boffin in school or whatever. And so the book is about these diverging sort of paths between the old petty bourgeoisie and what I called the new petty bourgeoisie, which is a big mass of downwardly mobile, white collar young people generally. And there's been a bunch of attempts to categorise this sort of class. I mean, Mike Savage calls them the emergent service workers. And he says, young people who live in cities, renting their houses, they've got a lot of educational qualifications, but they haven't got any money. So I'm arguing that that's actually the new petty. I call it the new petty bourgeoisie. So it's this group is, while the traditional petty bourgeoisie has been upwardly mobile, this group of people, the new petty bourgeoisie. So I say basically me, and possibly Nathan Kieran, dependent. But people who are if you look at the basis of movements like Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, but also like Podemos and Syriza, and now I can't remember the name of the movement in Chile, but this group has been the driving force behind sort of progressive or social democratic movements across the world. Generally speaking, the working class haven't really been. They have been involved in those movements, but they haven't been the major force. If you look at sort of if you look at the policies that are at the centre of a lot of these social democratic movements now, especially under Corbyn, it's and Bernie Sanders, it's cancel student debt, things about housing. And in America, obviously, there's a lot of controversy about that because statistically going to university is still a minority experience, but it became central to these movements because so many of the people who were driving this movement are sort of in this same boat, the declassed graduates. So yeah, so basically there's the two parts that make up the whole, and together, I'm arguing in the book that it's a really massive, it's a huge class in society. It's really significant, and I don't want to go like, oh, it's my lived experience, therefore I'm the expert. But like, I've had, through being in academia, through being in like leftist movements of various degrees of success and things like that, I do think I've got like an intimate understanding of these, the desires and the sort of the norms and the values of the new petty bourgeoisie, as well as the sort of old communities. The old community I grew up in, like places like Porthcawl. And it's funny because when the new petty bourgeoisie, if you see that, if you spend, apologies if you don't spend every waking moment on Twitter, but it's funny because on over Christmas, all these young lefties that I follow, they always go back to their old because they all live in London, and they all going back to their old small town, which is where they're sort of from. And there's always they always talk about this big culture clash. Oh, I've run into my friends from from school, or had an argument with my uncle over Brexit at the table and things like that. But that is almost like quite a unique experience of social mobility, is what defines both strands of the petty bourgeoisie. That's the thing they have in common. And because I have anxiety about my class, or upward and downward social mobility, but throughout history, not generally speaking, the working class don't move, and generally speaking, the working class stay where they are. There's also, if you look at all the available data, the working class don't want to leave their community. They want to stay put, and sort of the managerial and the professional and the sort of the bourgeois class, they don't tend to move much either. They're going to be okay, because of assets and various other forms of sort of capital. They're going to stay where they are as well. But it's the petty bourgeois that move up and down, and I think it's that mobility that defines both fractions of the class. The difference is that which splits them off politically, is that the old petty bourgeoisie has, well, not now, but under Thatcherism, for example, did quite well, and that was what locked it into the sort of status quo. Whereas the new petty bourgeoisie, I wouldn't like live in proof, like you just haven't done very well. But now, I mean, we'll probably get to this at the end. But now I think that there's a moment where the old petty bourgeoisie are sort of really have become detached from that ruling bloc that they were brought into under Thatcherism, and you can see that they're sort of starting to kick off around Europe.
And I think that's that kind of leads on to the next question, because there's like a really interesting chapter in the book which I think sort of goes through the kind of the history of that class and their role in different very pivotal like political moments throughout history. And you kind of argue that they're a class that can sort of split both ways when it comes politically, and also I think argue like very convincingly that they've been a real driving force behind like a lot of things, both historically and in sort of more recent British and American history. And you alluded to like some of those things like Brexit, Trump, but equally like Corbyn, Sanders. So yeah, just kind of give an overview then, maybe a bit of like how you see that has worked historically and then recently as well, and what is it that drives the petty bourgeoisie to go towards one type of politics or another?
The history chapter, it took ages to write the history chapter. In a way, it's like a revisionist history of class and historical development. If you are like a Marxist or if you're a socialist, there's this tendency, you view the historical development of society, you view history as a history of class struggle. You tend to view history as being neatly divided into, well, there was a big proletariat, there was a big working class, and then there was the sort of boss class, and through this sort of dialectical struggle, that's how society changed through revolution and things like that. But what I try to do in the book is actually it's never been this too simple two class society. The petty bourgeoisie have always been very influential. Right back to the sort of the early, not pre-capitalism, but the foundation of capitalism in the countryside. Obviously, because we didn't have the proletariat, because we didn't have the Industrial Revolution. There was always this like middle farmer that sort of drove capitalism, and then in the small towns there were these, well, you call them artisans, the small merchant, and then they sort of grew into become the bourgeoisie. But they always played almost like a stabilizer role. So back in medieval, pre-industrial capitalist times, you had the small burgher or the small artisan had this dependent relationship with the gentry. They were the ones that would be used as the local militia to oppress, the peasants and the sort of landless workers. And throughout history, like if you look at it was the petty bourgeoisie that was actually if you look at Chartism, for example, and when Marx was looking at early working class, or what he called working class movements, it wasn't yet this like factory proletariat. It was small artisans, and they drove. They were key to Owenite socialism, Chartism, and then and as Mowgli said, the paradox of the petty bourgeoisie is that in different historical eras they split left or right politically. So they go from in the late 19th century, being this very radical force, and also, it's quite annoying. After I've finished the book, you keep reading about this stuff, and then you come across all these histories which would have made the book a lot better. But I came across this book by Mike Davis, who was sadly recently passed away, Mike Davis, and he says that the anarchist movement in the late 19th century, for example, when they were sort of in Russia, the Narodniks and things, and in Paris when they were blowing up the princes and things like that. He says that was almost entirely driven by artisans, and he says it was the petty bourgeoisie that were getting frustrated that this new working class wasn't sort of catching up with them in radicalism. It was like, oh, come on, like, I thought you guys, and then, but then, 30 years later, if you look at this, and this is why they get a bad name, because in the 30s and the 20s in Italy and then the 30s in Germany, the petty bourgeoisie did become the major social base of fascism in Italy, and then in Spain, and then in Germany. And it's less well known over here because I think in the UK fascism is just an abstract thing that only happens on the continent or whatever. But like in Germany, when I was doing the research, it's quite they called Nazism the logical culmination of the crisis of the Mittelstand. So it was the white collar workers and self-employed workers and then small farmers that really formed the social basis of Nazism, and which, as I said, that's unfortunately when you're arguing that you have to form a class alliance with the petty bourgeoisie. But then, hopefully, as we'll talk about later, on a global scale, the petty bourgeoisie played a massively progressive role in third world liberation movements, and mainly because in places like Africa and South America there wasn't an industrial proletariat because these countries hadn't been fully industrialized. So if you look at Fanon, Cabral, and all these people who write about the third world, it was the petty bourgeoisie that played this really radical anti-colonial role in Africa and South America. And then I'm trying to think of other good things they've done. But then in the UK, the Thatcherism is a continuing theme in the book, and again I sort of got obsessed with reading about Thatcher, and in a way that probably would make people uncomfortable just to how much I was talking about her at the time. But what was really fascinating was the way that Thatcherism and Thatcher, because Thatcher was almost a personification of the traditional petty bourgeoisie. I think it was Christopher Hitchens called her like a Poujadiste female after the Poujade movement, which was the movement of small shopkeepers in France. And then there was all these interviews with the New York Times in the 70s, when I think it was one of the aristocrats in the Conservative Party said to a reporter, she is a petty bourgeois. She is a petty bourgeois. And if you read about Thatcher, her entire politics, everything about Thatcher was rooted in her experiences growing up as the daughter of a greengrocer. And in that same New York Times article, they said Thatcher was Grantham writ large. And, you know, so Thatcherism, when we think of Thatcherism and we think of sort of as neoliberalism, as this sort of generic social phenomenon that's just happened in the UK. And when we think of the class element of neoliberalism, we think of it as the transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, and that is what it is. But we don't think about the fact that what Thatcherism really wanted to do was to change the class structure, and she wanted to restore this idea of the UK that she'd grown up with, you know, this idea of small towns, chocolate box houses, where there wasn't this big angry working class bloc that sort of emerged with their trade unions to ruin everyone's sort of peace and quiet. And she really made an attempt. I mean, and if you look at everything she said and did in when she was in power, I mean, she really did hate working class people. She despised them. But that was because it is almost everything that she had growing up, this idea that working class people they're always in debt, they can't pay her dad's, you know, so the dad had to give them credit and things like that. She just didn't trust the working class. Equally, it's quite funny because she actually hated aristocrats as well. I mean, I think if you watch The Crown, I know Nathan Kieran, like, obsessed with The Crown. But there was this thing, this scene in The Crown where Thatcher apparently was rude to the Queen, or didn't like the Queen, and that came...
She goes to stay with her in Balmoral and she's horrified.
Oh, yeah.
She's horrified at how these people live.
Yeah, and...
They don't work, they're not as clean.
Yeah, and exactly. And so Thatcher actually, you know, the thing about the petty bourgeoisie is that they hated the working class, and they also hated the people above them as well. And if you actually look at Thatcherism as sort of complex ideology, the way she sort of talked about society, she directly appealed to these sort of these petty bourgeois values. So it wasn't just the feckless working class; it was also these bureaucrats in the civil service. She attacked the welfare state because it was full of these out-of-touch professionals. So it sort of attacks the people above and it attacks people below. And she was really smart because she just peeled off this enormous chunk of people, the low middle class, and she just brought them into the ruling bloc. And that's where they've stayed ever since. That they're the main basis of what we call right-wing populism in the UK is the low middle classes. And that they were the main social base behind Brexit, the main almost ridiculously overrepresented in the Brexit and UKIP vote. And under Thatcher, the professional managerial classes, they left the Conservative Party. It wasn't a big middle class, it wasn't a broad middle class movement, because her social conservatism that she thought appealed to the low middle classes horrified these progressive sort of manager professionals, you know, the doctors and lawyers and things like that. And they abandoned the Conservative Party, and they are now obviously leading the Labour Party. But it's just, you know, you have to, when we're thinking about sort of neoliberalism and society as like a totality, you know, you have to think about because I thought there was this tendency on the left to think about history as and where we are now. It's ideology is something that just sort of seeps down, and we all sort of internalise it equally, and it affects everyone. But I think there's a real class dimension, and I think you have to really understand these values. And you said the cleanliness thing is funny. It's like cleanliness is next to godliness. It's upright morality that has traditionally defined the petty bourgeoisie. But now, if you look at the modern day, what I'm arguing by the end of the book is that the low middle classes haven't really been given anything. They haven't really been given any concessions, because Thatcher did give people the right to buy. You know, and there's all these sort of ethnographic studies of working class because let's not forget, you know, thousands or if not millions of working class people vote for Thatcher as well, because of things like the right to buy, and because of the way she whipped up fears about the organised working class. But now, yeah, I don't think they've been given any concession for about 25 years, because the 80s is 20 years ago. But no, but you know, because for 50 odd years, and that's why there's this real potential at the moment. It's quite a dangerous moment in society, because, you know, again, I started to read Trotsky after the book is finished, basically. But Trotsky says, you know, like a man possessed in a fever who tosses to the left and right, the petty bourgeoisie can go to the left or the right. But he also says an angry petty bourgeoisie, which we're seeing now with like the farmers' rallies and across Europe, he says that is like the surest indicator of a pre-revolutionary dangerous moment that you'll ever come across. And if you actually look at what's happening across Europe, it hasn't really happened in the UK yet, because everything, the right populism has been reabsorbed by the Conservative Party. But if you look at what's happening in Europe with the farmers' protests, and there are other protests kicking off as well, but like the yellow vests in France, the truckers' protests in Canada, and obviously Trumpism, they're detached from the status quo. But we'll talk about sort of what to do later, I think. Maybe.
Yeah, I think we can come back to that, and because I think, and it's such a good point in terms of like, I think you either say in the book or you said it at some point about like Thatcher was like a genuine revolutionary, like she like restructured British society, and we are living in like the country that she created. And I think like it'd be interesting because I think to ask about how you think. So obviously a lot of what we've been talking about so far is about like the UK as a whole, and except for like Porthcawl we've spoken about in like a bit
special
more detail.
place.
But I wonder like to what extent you think that these descriptors and these like this analysis, like how much you can map on like the description of it in Britain as a whole to like Wales specifically. Do you think there are differences when it comes to Wales in terms of like different geographic parts of Wales, or like, you know, the intersection with like with national identity? Does that sort of, are there ways that you think that there are differences, or and what they are?
Absolutely. So when I was talking about the book on Twitter when I first started, someone said, well, you know, Wales, this doesn't apply to Wales because Wales doesn't have a petty bourgeoisie. Basically, Wales is just everyone's working class. And I think the answer is really complex because in some ways that is correct. So so different parts of the UK do have different class structures. And what I wanted to do with the book, especially in the conclusion, is get away from this. I mean, I've just been talking about this like step in about the way I've been talking about like the petty bourgeoisie and Thatcherism is really talking about stereotype. And when you look at the global role of the petty bourgeoisie, it has not always been reactionary, hasn't always been to the right. And one of the biggest, Marxists used to dislike regional nationalist movements, including in Wales and Ireland and Scotland, because they said, well, they're led by the low middle classes, they're led by the petty bourgeoisie, and that is generally true. But what I would argue is that the petty bourgeoisie or the low middle classes, for example, in regional nationalist movements, have played that's a progressive role, you know, to break up the British state, for example. I see that as progressive. But in terms of the Welsh class structure, it is interesting because on the one hand you have this, not complacency, but there's this idea that South Wales is a homogeneously, in particular, it's held up, isn't it, as a homogeneously working class place. You know, the valleys are just, terraced houses, and there's the mines and heavy industry. But obviously, if you actually go to the valleys, well, look, there's loads of red row estates. There's people don't work down the mines anymore. The class structure has changed. There is still a large working class in South Wales, as it is in all deindustrialised areas, although it has been recomposed. So if you look at Gabriel Wynant's book, was it the next shift? The types of work that occur in these areas have changed. It's no longer heavy industry. It's care work, it's call centre work, and things like that. But again, I don't really think that's paid much attention to. There's still this idea of the sepia photo of the working class. Everyone still works in heavy industry. So on the one hand, if you look at places like Bridgend, why did Bridgend go Conservative in 2019? There's a big shock because it's like part of the Red Wall. But if you actually look at Bridgend, well, you walk around the council estates, the former council estates, and actually most people own their own houses. There's red row houses, there's new build estates everywhere. There's out-of-town shopping centres, people work in the hospital. So I argue in Wales that the class structure has changed just like it has everywhere else in the UK. That the middle classes, both the professional managerial classes and the low middle classes, like the petty bourgeoisie, have grown. And in particular, one of the interesting things in Wales is, we've changed the class structure through devolution in a way. I mean, there's an enormous bureaucratic, let's call it, what they call, Dominic Cummings called it the blob or whatever. But there is now a professional class in Wales that we never used to have. There was never a traditionally Wales didn't have a local bourgeoisie. I think that's the driving argument of Simon Brooks's books. But now we do have a professional class. And obviously, the interesting thing about Wales is that the class structure intersects with nation in a way that it just doesn't in England. And obviously, I'll hopefully be back next year, so I'll plug my book talking about the intersection of national identity and class. But in my PhD research, people in Porthcawl felt they were ambivalent about Welshness. They were ambivalent about the Welsh language, because to them, being properly Welsh meant being working class from the valleys, saying but and playing rugby and things like that. And obviously, those weren't signifiers that anyone in Porthcawl, or people in Porthcawl, felt they possessed. And so, in the end, they clung to Britishness as something which was less classed as a national identity. So there's this really interesting, and obviously, I find it fascinating within the Welsh language, because Di Smith's book is there, and Di Smith, I think, says in his autobiography, he has this sort of lifelong, an axe to grind against the Welsh language, because he says when he's grown up in Barry, it was the Welsh speakers, or the Crachach or whatever, who, according to him, ran the town. They were the most influential class. But obviously, you go to a place, you only have to go to Carnarvon and Bangor and North Wales to see that the Welsh language. I played football for Nantlle Vale. I was in Penygroes for a while. The Welsh language is a language of the working class in North Wales, and all that is missed when this sort of simplistic idea that the Welsh language is associated with sort of professionals. But nonetheless, there are obviously interesting sort of class dynamics that play out within the Welsh speaking world. I never presume to sort of speak for that world, because I can't speak Welsh. But I do think the interesting thing about the low middle classes, the petty bourgeoisie, as in Wales and Scotland and other countries, is it has historically played a very progressive role, and I think more and more it is sort of polarised towards radical, and not more and more, it always has been polarised towards radical political positions. I think me and Patrick spoke about, if you look at what is the social basis of Plaid Cymru in places like Carnarvon. There isn't that much work done on, what the social basis is of the social basis of Plaid Cymru. Is it the low middle classes? Is it the professional classes? Is it the working classes? There's all these interesting questions that I think are worth exploring, but can't really be understood if we have, if we approach class just in terms of culture. Like who, where you shop, or what you eat, or what TV you watch, and what music you listen to. But also, B, if you're looking at class in this, there's a working class, and then there's the bourgeoisie. You can't really understand the complexity of society if you're looking at, if you understand class in that black and white way. But it is, Wales is obviously I think, and we all agree, like a deeply interesting place to study. And it always has an outsized. It is a counterintuitive thing to talk about sometimes in Wales, because Wales has always had an enormous proletariat. Same as the UK in general. That's why Marx and Engels were so obsessed with studying the UK, because it just has this enormous factory proletariat. But the problem with thinking of, it almost leads to a complacency. That we're always going to vote the right way because everyone's working class, for example. And if the uncomfortable truth is that Conservatives have always had a large presence in South Wales and the South Wales valleys and in Cardiff. And if you don't, and that stuff is hard to understand if you don't understand the low middle class.
Well, and the question that always gets ignored is like, who are the people who aren't voting, and who are the people who are voting? Like, that just seems to get forgotten. So which kind of leads on then to kind of what do you think in terms of, like, those of us who want to see like the success of left politics. And you talk about the need at the end in the conclusion for like new alliances between the working class and both strands of the petty bourgeoisie. There are obviously barriers to that at the moment. So what is it you think like needs to be done?
Well, it was good it was in the book. Started getting back into Lenin, which is obviously always a good idea. But if you actually go back and read these sort of classic texts, Lenin and Trotsky and Gramsci and things, they always say, we need to build class alliances. We need to build a broad class alliance, and the idea of hegemony is sort of thrown around a lot. But hegemony means leadership. It means to lead, and the reason Gramsci and Lenin idolized, I say fetishized, but the reason they saw the proletariat was so special because they thought that the proletariat, the working class, can lead this broad class alliance, because they said the petty bourgeoisie, for all its power and strength, couldn't lead. It couldn't lead a mass movement, or because it was chaotic, because it had chaotic politics, because it also had a stake in the system. Marx and Engels, when they were talking about the Civil War in Germany and things, they said, well, what would happen is the petty bourgeoisie would kick off, and there's a real sort of tendency to violence and street politics in a way that the working class certainly didn't have. Gramsci used to say that as soon as they get angry, the petty bourgeoisie, they go out and start smashing the place up immediately. There's no sort of they were seen as impatient. But when Lenin looked at the class structure of Russia, he said, well, look at the class structure. Taking the class structure as it is will determine how we build a mass movement. And he said that the working class weren't the majority there. There was how do you work with other allied classes? And I sort of think that because the left have used this idea of the 99%, we are the people, for the many, not the few, the 99%. It's just sort of mushed everyone under the bosses into this big mass. This idea that we don't own the means of production, so we're all sort of the same, and that has overlooked all these glaring class divides between the sort of lower middle classes, the managerial classes, the working classes. But because it has overlooked the divides, it doesn't really know how to build alliances, because if you take everyone as if you take the subordinate or the classes as this 99%, and you don't realise what the tensions are, then how are you going to overcome those tensions? And so I think that we are in a moment now where, if you look at the unpopularity of the Conservative Party, and if you look at the experience of COVID, for example, if you look at the idea of key workers during COVID, well, it was small businesses and key workers and the working class that were really obviously keeping society going during COVID. And I really think the traditional working class that might have been Thatcherite or whatever for the last 50 years has really become polarized towards the working class, and it's a really powerful potential ally. But the issue is, how do we and if you look at what's happening now with the strikes are enormously popular, and I really didn't think they would be that popular, because the Tory sort of attack lines just aren't landing, because I think particularly the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, the scales have fallen off a lot of people's eyes, and there is this real potential for a broad class alliance, with a lower middle class bloc. I'm writing an article for New Socialist at the moment, but one of the stumbling blocks is, well, the new petty bourgeoisie that was the sort of because in a way there's already almost an informal lower middle class bloc, but the problem is at the moment is that low earners in the UK are voting Conservative. There's already this idea, there's already a big divide between the political classes, or what Piketty calls the Brahmin left, the progressive classes, and sort of everyone else outside the city, out beyond the pale, as it used to be in Ireland. So the issue is, well, how do you bring the new petty bourgeoisie into this alliance, with the working class, with the low middle classes, which is where they should be, because they've got the same economic interest. We've all got the same economic interest in changing society. And I think what's happened sort of with the strikes has been, I mean, I think, well, the unions, the RMT has settled. The unions are being picked off one by one. But I think if you actually looked at what happened, you actually did have the working class really assume a leadership role. And the white-collar unions, UCU, the nurses and the civil servants, sort of tucked in behind.
Yeah.
And that's where, and it was a lot, you could see it was a lot more of a threat to the establishment, in my view, than, for example, the student movement or the Corbyn movement. And that's not, I mean, again, I was obviously very pro that movement, but in terms of its leverage, it doesn't have much leverage. And there was an article in Novara the other day, and it said about this new radical generation. Is it Gen Z we're on? So Gen Z are so there's a really radical generation that's the basis of Corbynism. They're going to transform society, but then sort of buried the lead in that article because it says, oh, by the way, only 5% of the under 30s are in trade unions, but they support trade unions. But I was like, well, the problem is that you've got a left or a progressive movement which stands apart from the workers. It's like, well, I support the strikes, but I'm not myself involved in the trade union. So in terms of like practically how we do it, I think it's obviously one is getting involved in your workplace in organising, but it's not just the workplace. It has to be the community, which obviously Sal and others have done so much great stuff in building strong communities, and obviously Cymdeithas, of course. So it has to be sort of the workplace and the community. And I also think, and this is sort of speculating now, but I also think like a consumer movement is we don't really. It's a bit ridiculous that Martin Lewis plays such a ridiculously important role in society, because we live in a consumerist society under sort of neoliberal capitalism, but we have no rights. We have next to no rights if like big companies want to, internet companies charge you for changing all these things. I think a consumer movement, so Don't Pay, was actually doing a lot of good, and the people said that Don't Pay in a way almost took down Kwarteng. This idea of actually we're not going to pay. Same with the poll tax. That's in a way a consumerist movement. So those are the sort of axes or vectors or avenues that I think we could sort of start to build a coalition. Obviously, it's not going to be easy.
No, but I think there's a positive, like, concrete suggestions.
Yeah.
So and ar y nodyn yna, oes unrhyw gwestiynau gan unrhyw un? Does anyone have any questions?
I'm too old for that.
Just keep the insults coming, Rob.
Yes, exactly. Well, this the request for respectability is the book. That's the real reason for doing it. No, I'll take it.
Just say for the recording, like a.
No.
Sorry.
Thanks so much, though, Rob. The idea of one, the environmental movement, and two, the changes to the world of work through things like automation. To go to automation first, so Andre Gores wrote the book Farewell to the Working Class, I think in the 60s, talking about the rise of automation and this idea that as automation degrades or makes the working class redundant, you have to think, well, who is going to be the motor of history if it's not the working class? Is it going to be a mass of people who are basically unemployed? And who is it going to be? But these are really, ChatGPT, the chat thing. I think ChatGPT has started getting A grades in US college exams. It started writing legal documents. The irony might be that it's the white collar workers that have their work automated first. Well, I guess the issue is obviously that if the way we work and live has been changed by neoliberalism, and it'll be changed even more by things like automation. And one of the biggest things, I do think it makes like organising harder, because if you look at the traditional idea of the working class that's going to drive the transformation of society, it really the ideal type is this factory proletariat, where everyone's working in a factory, or skilled manual workers, and they're in a trade union, and they're just going to develop their collective strength, and they'll take over, and we'll have a socialist state. And obviously the issue is, as you rightly point out, that is increasingly not how we live. People aren't working in collective industries, they're working in more isolated units in sort of bogus self-employment, and it's proved incredibly difficult to organise people. But I think that society will change, and the challenges will obviously get harder, but the need to try to bring people together will always remain the same. The environmental question is really interesting, because I can't remember the guy who wrote this new book in America, but because there is a tension on the one hand between, in terms of policy, if you saw that with coal miners in America who voted for Trump because Clinton basically visits them and says, "Hey, guess what? We're gonna get rid of all your jobs, but hopefully you'll vote for me." And Trump said, "Well, guess what? We're not. We're going to keep investing in coal." And if you look at the truckers' strike and things like that, and all these protests, the people who work in fossil fuel, which is obviously a massive factor in sort of the destruction of the environment, often self-employed, often working class. There's an issue. How do we have this like green revolution and get people on board with it? I think, and if funny enough, if you actually look at things like the 15-minute city protest in Oxford, I mean, a lot of that was sort of conspiracy theory and conspiratorial. I mean, you obviously, Patrick, I think you're back in Oxford, but didn't see you on that protest. But the danger with, in my view, the danger with an environmental movement which becomes too sort of statist and sort of all stick and like no carrot, is that it's gonna alienate people, the very people who need to be brought on. And obviously, if you haven't used I know Rob will have, but there's the idea of the Lucas Plan. I think it was the 70s or the 80s, where these factory workers in America were about to have their factory shut down, and they came up with this plan. Well, we can just transition this factory and make into green manufacturing, because the environmental movement, we all talk about it as if everything, we're going to need manufacturing to obviously make wind turbines and things to retrofit houses, and the way I think to get people on board is to, like when they shut the Ford plant in Bridgend, I thought, well, why can't you just repurpose that for a nationalised green a factory making, or maybe I'm being naive, but I thought that, but it's obviously a tension, and we have to be very careful, I think, in how we overcome it, because I think there's people saw like the trucker protests in Canada and the fuel protests in the UK, and it's like, how do we ally as like progressive movement with these people who are all polluters? They're all into fossil fuels, but it can be done by sort of talking to people, and I think most people have the same interest at the end of the day. Most people want to be able to get to work, put food on the table. It's just how the left has a tendency to be quite like shouty and judgmental, and to realise that sort of most people, I'd say most people at the moment, are potential allies, potential comrades or whatever you want to call them. And I think it's both. I think you're bang on, by the way. I think the idea of the danger with policies like the 4-day working week is that you're gonna have a, well, if you look at the statistics on home working, for example, I mean, the ONS did home working versus people who had to work during the pandemic, and the wealth, the class, or you can call it class divide or income divide, was enormous. And I think it's like only 5 or 10% of the Welsh government are even in the office. The majority are at home. But the reality is most people in low-paid jobs obviously have to go into work during the pandemic. And with things like the 4-day working week, I think the danger is it'll just be. And I'm not saying. I mean, there is also a danger for professionals that what will happen if people just condense the working week into 5-day working week into 4 days and make that 4 incredibly miserable days rather than 5 slightly less miserable days. Yeah. But there's a danger of obviously having a 2-tier workforce in terms of some people. But we've already got a 2-tier workforce. So, for example, that when I was doing the statistic, I mean, for my day job now, when I'm looking at statistics in the trade union movement, I mean, the majority of people who are in trade unions are people who have like flexi working in the public sector, for example. And it's good they're in trade unions because in a way that's just defending those working conditions. But the majority of people working in the private sector, these things are, well, I think who has flexible work, and people, people working in supermarkets or on building sites can't say, I'll just make a time up tomorrow, or I'll work from home today, or things like that. So there is obviously a massive danger with it. There is, as you say, there is a cultural antipathy to not sort of grafting, and that's one of the and it's also this idea of, as we with Rob saying, automation and working less, and obviously that's the goal, is to work less, but there is a cultural amongst the sort of people I've grown up with of sort of fetishizing overwork in a way of like grafting, gotta work until you sort of drop dead, and again that's a tension in sort of if we're bringing out policies and thinking of policies and how are they going to be taken up and how are they going to be viewed. So for example, universal basic income, I won't say how my friends think of things like universal basic income, because it's not very, they're not very fond of the idea, because again it comes back to that old class divide of the perception of some people getting something for nothing and other people having to pay for people not to. But obviously you have to work through, you have to challenge those ideas, because where does that graft narrative lead? Potentially is the things like, well, people who can't work aren't valuable anymore. People who do, people who have retired aren't valuable. So it can be quite a dangerous that fetish of hard work, and the workers versus the shirkers, or hard working people you can see how it can easily lend itself to quite problematic, if not fascistic, ideas about vulnerable people or people who can't work. But I don't know if that answers the question. I don't know what the answer is with things like. Yeah, no, thanks.
Any sense that amongst the anti-bourgeoisie, either, well, no, particularly the new ones, that actually they're suffering, if you like, and downwardly mobile, has any connection whatsoever to do with the prevailing economic system, the neoliberal economic system, the global monetary system, which is busy going around hoovering up money from wherever it can find, including from them. Do they have any? Is there any sort of semblance of that? And the other thing was, okay, so if you're a politician, what is it? And I mean, at a very simplistic level, just thinking back, oh yes, take back control, this sort of thing. I mean, what is it that would appeal to the
Yeah. Oh, sorry. So the new petty bourgeoisie, I think, are obviously a more of a difficult and complex fraction, and I know it's the part of the book that a lot of people just won't agree with. And when Poulan-Sass sort of started talking about the new petty bourgeoisie in the 70s, he was sort of roundly attacked, because people would say, well, actually, this is just an educated fraction of the working class or whatever. They don't own anything. I think the new petty bourgeoisie are in a quite a complex position economically and socially, which also feeds into the politics and how to appeal to them. Because if you actually look at a lot of where the new petty bourgeoisie work, or where they end up working or aspire to work, it is often in the public sector. It's often in teaching, academia, medicine. I can't think of other examples, but it's social work, and those are these are obviously fields and sectors which have been degraded. They've teaching is a classic example of a profession that has been sort of de-skilled, degraded in terms of the money and things like that. So the problem, I think, comes in terms of it goes back to the other question of building class alliances. Is I think that amongst the sort of popular classes, or the lower middle classes, the working classes, and the traditional petty bourgeoisie, the ones that are mobilising at the moment, and are involved in sort of right populism, I think there's a real dislike of the state and of the bureaucracy and sort of big capital. And I think the problem with building class alliances is that the new petty bourgeoisie are very often just perceived as, and also I should say people don't like globalization at all, and that was obviously a massive factor in the Brexit vote. The problem is the sort of many working class people and the traditional petty bourgeoisie would just perceive, let's say, young Corbynistas as just being part of that sort of state, that the global sort of system, and it is difficult in terms of how you create a political movement based on that, trying to build a coalition between that new group and everyone else, because things like abolishing student debt is good. I think it's a good thing. The issue is it like a minority? Is that a minority? Is that tangible to people? But I think there are things that everyone sort of has. I do think there are things that everyone has in common, but housing is another classic problem. So obviously housing is enormously central to young left-wing activists and left politics, and it's enormous. Almost all sort of student or left-wing politics is driven by housing precarity. The issue in terms of forming political alliances is the majority of people in the UK are homeowners, which is an uncomfortable truth. And what I thought during the Corbyn moment was there was this real this perception that everyone else had it easy, because they owned their own house, and it's almost that this was an unbridgeable class divide because you had homeowners versus non-homeowners. But I think that was sort of myopic, because obviously if you look at people on the picket lines now, a lot of the posties I'm researching, they all own their own houses, all got mortgages. They're all very radical people. They're in trade unions. Just because they have a mortgage doesn't mean they can't be sort of socialists. But I'm trying to think of like how to create sort of a policy on the hoof. But there are obviously ways of bringing people into sort of a mass movement. And the redistribution of wealth, the sorting out the NHS, having education system, well-paying jobs. These are things that are universal, and it's focusing on trying to work. I guess the point of building class coalitions and understanding differences between classes is that once you understand what the differences are, then you can work out, well, what are the things that everyone does actually have in common. There are totally unproblematic, and like, better wages, better public transport, better public services. I think there are things that, to be, no, amazing question. To be clear, I agree with that, the latter perspective. So obviously there's a big bit that Trotsky says is that the reason the petty bourgeoisie threw their lot in behind the fascists was because the working class equivocated, because they looked at the working class and thought they're not seriously going to change society. They thought, well, they didn't have the sort of, say, balls. They just didn't have the will. And I think there's a lot of that now. I mean, Corbyn couldn't even deal with, for all his strength, couldn't even deal with the Labour right wing. So how on earth is he going to deal with the attacks that would happen, would the onslaught that would have occurred to that Labour government if he had got in? And there's this idea of strength and radicalism that, as you say, that when the working class takes the lead and it shows that it is going to transform society, that's when the petty bourgeoisie will go over to it. But as long as it thinks the working class isn't serious about society, changing society, it will go with fascism. And the reason it went to fascism was because the fascists looked genuinely as if they were going to change society. Obviously they don't. That's the point. They take over power and then they create this sort of corporatist movement. But at least in terms of how they mobilise the sort of the rhetoric, the street protests, it looks as if they're going to do it. The idea that other teachers and the white collar workers, are they the new petty bourgeoisie or are they the working class? I obviously in the book say that they are. I still consider them the new petty bourgeoisie, but I totally, it's not something I'm, even though I'll back out, but like I've written a book on it, but I'm not precious about it. I think it's not. One way to look at it is Eric Olin Wright's idea of, there are permeable class boundaries, and some people just occupy the grey area between classes, and I think that's a good way of looking at particularly like nurses and teachers. And also, Barbara Ehrenreich says, well, you can be in the same profession or the same sector. You can be a nurse, a teacher, a doctor, and you can have different people occupy different class positions within the same class based on whether they have their background, where they have management responsibilities, whether they, how they've sort of got to that point and things like that. On the one hand, I do think they're very easily polarised towards they are obviously polarised towards the working class at the moment. I always think about this interview Barbara Ehrenreich. So, if you're not familiar with Barbara Ehrenreich, she wrote this idea of the professional managerial class, the idea that there is this big sort of autonomous professional strata that is increasingly influential in politics. And if you look at the Labour Party leadership in particular, I think you can see, well, that there is whether they're a class or whether they're a cultural group is another matter. But Ehrenreich said one of the problems that the left have always had, because it's always been made up of social workers and teachers and so on, she says you've got a left which is made up of people who for their day job tell working class people what to do. And they said she said she really thought there's a big issue with that, not control, but if you're in a almost a paternal relationship with the working class, if you're telling people, listen, this is what you need to do for your day job, that in itself constitutes some form of a divide, whether it's a class divide or a cultural divide. In my experiences of being on the left, those things are an issue, because you have, how are you going to get people to, but it also leads to a kind of paternalism which has always defined the labour movement in the UK, which is basically, you see it in the Fabians, we will tell the working class what to do and we will lead them, but the working class themselves will not lead, we'll just sort of tell them what to do. And that is something that obviously has to be resisted, and that's why I thought the ongoing strikes were so exciting and interesting, because there wasn't really, a class of people who were sort of an intellectual vanguard or whatever, or a party that was separate from the working class. It was just the working class, ordinary people were just leading it themselves. which is why I think people saw it. People on the left saw it as quite scary as well. I think because it's almost like this revolution, this movement that we thought we would be leading, and we would be the vanguard. Oh, that's just happening over there without us. You know, we're playing. We're just watching. But yeah, I think that's a great question. I agree.